Welcome. I'm Sandy Boyd, the CEO of Seek Common Ground, and welcome to our learning community talk on lessons from the field, elevating community voice for federal relief funding for education. Joining us today are 4 project leaders from the 3rd phase of Seek Common Ground's Action American Rescue Plan Action Accelerator. And I'd like to introduce Kit Anderson from CivicLex, Zaki Ansari from AQE in New York City, Shirley Brandman from the Black and Brown Coalition in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Sanford Johnson from Teach Plus Mississippi. Their bios are in the chat box, so please feel free to take a look at everybody's bios if you don't know these fabulous people that are on your screens. I also want to just mention that 5th member of the ARPA Action Accelerator, New Mexico First, couldn't join us today, but do want to give a shout out to Danielle Gonzalez and Sharon Berman, who did incredible work statewide in New Mexico to determine citizen priorities across all issue areas, including a focus on mental and behavioral health. And the final report from that work is also in the chat, so you can learn more about that work. And I will try to bring some of those points from New Mexico First in as we have the conversation. So just wanted to acknowledge the good work of New Mexico First. See, Common Ground has supported education advocates at both the state and the local level to drive community-based decision-making on federal relief funding for almost 2 years. During that time, we've supported 14 projects and disseminated nearly $300,000 in direct project funding, as well as provided access to expertise, a learning community for project leaders, and a forum to share their work and ideas. So today's discussion will focus on what our most recently supported projects worked on and the lessons that they learned to share with the work. For the talk today, panelists will give an overview of their projects and will discuss the themes that emerged. The first 40 minutes of this conversation will be recorded. To round out the hour, we'll stop recording and invite those of you that would like to join us live to have an off-the-record discussion with our panel to ask those questions you might not want to ask in a recorded forum. Like all of our talks, our session today, the recorded part of our session today will be on our YouTube channel within a week. We'll also post links to the materials that panelists reference and that have been developed over the course of the project in the YouTube description. So don't feel like you have to frantically take notes. We will make sure all of that gets posted. Throughout the talk, we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A function. If we don't get to questions, we'll make sure that we do in the recorded portion, we'll make sure that we do in the off-the-record discussion. Oof, so with all of that as background, let me go ahead and get started with everyone today. And I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to talk a little bit more about their projects, but I want to go back to that idea and sort of the way we framed this discussion about with both ESSER and ARP funding, these were huge influxes of funding, the most we've ever seen in education in our lifetime. And with respect to the education funding, communities were supposed to, the Department of Education made clear they were supposed to be part of the decision-making process for how resources to recover from COVID should be allocated. And I'm interested, as you talk about your projects from your vantage point, how did that play out in practice? What community members did you make sure had a seat at the table? And while you're telling us that, tell us a little bit more about your project and your goals. And so let me go ahead. I'm going to give everybody about 5 minutes so we can have enough time for a robust discussion. But Zakiyah, why don't we start with you?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sandy. I'm Zaki Ansari. I'm the Advocacy Director for the leading statewide alliance fighting for equitable funding schools, the Alliance for Quality Education. I'm a mom of 8 and been doing educational justice work for a little over 2 decades. Super honored to once again be part of the Seek Common Ground team in regards to like on the receiving end of being able to help us like fulfill or work on our commitment for this particular year. So I don't know how many folks know, New York City got almost $7 billion from between ARPA and all the other federal COVID relief dollars. 7 with a B, not an M, but a B. And I think very early on, we knew that if we were not paying attention to what was happening with those dollars, the system would use it the way it saw fit. And I think we saw that not only in New York, but across the country. Systems across the country didn't really engage parents the way they needed to. And we knew that we didn't want the money spent because we had already been doing organizing with parents and community members and educators and young people around these dollars. So it was just a continuation of this, right? There were some situations and circumstances that we didn't foresee, which I'll share a little bit down the line, meeting with the new mayor and all the things. And he just took us to a whole nother level of talking about fighting for equity. But our goal was to really, from the very beginning with our project, was to connect parents with decision makers, also community members and others, to weigh in on policy and spending priorities, right? We had already started the conversation when the monies first were coming down the pike to engage parents statewide, and we wanted to make sure that New York City was spending its money right. As you know, just like everywhere else across the country, students, especially students of us who are living in poverty, but Black and brown students were the ones who were on the receiving end of everybody noticing that they didn't have all the things they needed. Unfortunately, it took a pandemic for that to happen. So we have this large influx of money, and what we wanted to make sure is that we were getting these dollars in New York City to be spent and invested in the right way, to support the right staff that's needed, if there was mental health services that were needed for young people, which we know they were, and families, right? Smaller class sizes, technology, and summer programs and accelerated learning, right? And we were fortunate we had a relationship with the New York City Comptroller already, Brad Lander, from years before. I might have shared AQE is about a little over 2 decades old. So we've had really cemented our relationships with elected officials and others. So as they have moved up from being a city council member to this, that, and the other, to mayor and all those things, we have managed to maintain those relationships. And it's really been helpful because there's a level of respect and understanding of our organization. They know where we are. We've been very consistent. It's been sustainable, et cetera. And so we were able to have the conversation with the comptroller even before he actually officially got into office. And so we were wondering, we said, if anybody can pay attention to where this money is, it is the comptroller. And so he put in an organizing component to his office. And right away, we organized with him to have a really great virtual, of course, town hall, because we were still in the midst of a pandemic, where we were able to explain to parents what kind of monies the school system got in New York City, both from the city, from the federal and the state level. So people had a full picture of how much money was in New York City, again, including the federal dollars. And he came out with a report which showed that more than half of the money, the federal money, was not spent. So all you need is the agitation of the parents to be like, is that why we don't have art? Is that why we don't have this? Is that why we don't have social workers, et cetera? And so that is the agitator. And then the next piece is what we do, which is the organizing, like move that agitation to action, right? And so parents and community members have been organizing, holding the Department of Education accountable, having actions with us on the steps of City Hall and other places saying, we have this money, still have billions of dollars left. And this is the switch that I was saying in the beginning, and I'll start to close, which is we have a mayor that's now in office, Eric Adams, who decided that he was going to cut budgets in the midst of understanding we had all this money. So we had that on top of knowing money was there, and now we had to fight for cuts not to happen, which we were not expecting, obviously, when you have at least $4 billion left in the kitty to fund. Who thought that a mayor would cut, right? And so we spent most of the summer really fighting for that. But one thing is for sure, had we not been on the forefront from the very beginning, had we not engaged parents in these conversations, young people, elected officials, had we not had a social media strategy to make sure that media understood what was happening, we would not have even had a fighting chance, right? We would not be, folks in media would not be covering the fact and talking about the federal dollars that were spent. We would not be talking about this cliff that's coming up, all the things, right? So there is definitely, because we were early on getting into this and because we've been consistent and parents have been agitated, we have built our broader reach as well as our deeper reach to communities for them to really be able to explain. And so that's creating materials, and documents that they need to be able to articulate it in the best way they see fit for parents that they're having their parent meetings and everything else. And we continue to maintain the relationships with comptrollers, city council members, and others as we are currently, as we talk right now, as we literally right now, about to go through budget modifications because of the whole budget cuts and all the things that we are still trying to strategize about how we don't allow more cuts to happen as we are now about to shift to the statewide stuff. So because of the work that we've been able to do, definitely the ARPA dollars, federal funding, and then the things that the schools need are definitely at the forefront and on the tips of the tongues of many folks out there, including press, which has been really helpful. It is not the end all and be all because we still have a struggle and work to be done, but it would not be here had we not been able to like really take that on and have parents engage in this in a way that they felt that they could actually speak to it.
Oh, thank you for that, Zakiyah. Let me turn it over to Shirley to sort of pick up.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be part of today's conversation. Shirley Brandman, I have the honor of serving as a strategic advisor to the Black and Brown Coalition for Educational Equity and Excellence. We're based in Montgomery County, Maryland. We're about 3 years old. And what was unique, and Sandy, this gets to your question a little bit, is that the coalition itself was founded on the idea that we needed to bring together parents and advocates in the African-American community with the Latino community who would often be in front of our school district advocating for resources, but honestly advocating in competition rather than in collaboration. And the recognition that if we can bring the Black and Brown communities standing shoulder to shoulder in their advocacy for support for their students, they represent the majority of the district, and leaning into the power that comes from representatives working together to speak about the needs and the lived experiences of the youth, and speaking with that kind of collective voice, beginning to shift the dynamics and the culture. So when we as a coalition get a seat at the table as a coalition, we're kind of by definition bringing the community voice, because we start by setting our agenda based on the needs and conversations that we've heard at the grassroots level, talking to students, talking to community members. And as everyone has touched on, no surprise that recovering from the pandemic, the mental health issues, the trauma of the fact that the Black and Brown communities were really hard hit just through the physical pandemic. The isolation hit many of our Black and Brown students and students from low-income families uniquely hard. So when schools were shuttered and we were learning like this, seeing each other in little boxes on a screen, it was uniquely hard for some of our students, and a recognition that you couldn't just get past that and say, all right, let's jump into, math and literacy and move forward. That there was a recognition that you needed to take a pause, recognize that support was going to be needed to make schools feel welcoming, to make sure that schools were aware of the trauma that students and their families experienced, to make sure that there was a general sense of being cared for and well-being, to make students available to learn. So our project really focused on the mental health issues, but while there were many, many dollars, and that's the theme of our conversation today, there was also a little bit of this cultural bent that, okay, so that means the school district by itself from its own budget has to fix everything related to student need and family need. And honestly, that wasn't realistic in the mental health area, both because it's not what schools are designed and expert to do, because the needs were cross-cutting. They weren't just in the schoolhouse, they were affecting students when they went home as well. And because the needs were, beyond just the school population. And there was expertise outside of our schools, in our departments of mental health and human services, in our community-based nonprofits that focused on mental health. So our project was about advocating with other grassroots providers to make sure that the county devoted dollars across the spectrum, so dollars that were coming into the government and not just the school district, to address mental health concerns that would support students, but also their families, and to really see this as a cross-cutting need and to build infrastructure that would be beyond what schools could do on their own. And that was really the focus of our effort.
Great. Good silo busting. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Kit?
Hi, everyone. As Shirley said, I'm Kit Anderson. I'm the Director of Operations and Evaluation for CivicLex. We're a nonprofit in Lexington, Kentucky, and our whole organization's goal is to make it for people to get involved, make it easier for people to get involved in local government, which can look like a lot of different things, including the project we did on ARPA funding, which for us was kind of an expansion of making it easier for people to get involved in local government to making it easier for people to get involved in local civic institutions, right? Because 3 different organizations in the city of Lexington received federal money, either ARPA or ESSER. It was our local government, our public transportation system, Lextran, and then our public schools, Fayette County Public Schools. So this was kind of a chance for us to kind of like broaden what civic infrastructure in Lexington means to us. And we were providing information and resources and opportunity for input for all 3 of those streams of funding. And I think that to Sandy's question of who we brought in like to be at the table, I think that CivicLex definitely did some baseline relational work of like people in our networks who we know are like important in different communities in Lexington, bringing them in, making sure they know what's going on. Obviously, we were communicating about ARPA through all of our channels, but the bulk of what we were trying to do was to make sure that the people who were showing up and who did care and wanted to advocate were able to do so effectively and in a way that they were empowered to do so, because ARPA came with a lot of rules, right? And there are a lot of stipulations, but a lot of those stipulations were very, very powerful and were designed to try to make this money go to places that it might not normally go, towards marginalized communities, towards public health, towards infrastructure. And so we know that most people don't have time to read through the interim final rule document that outlines all the stipulations of ARPA. And we also know that people in power a lot of the time like to use stipulations like that as a shield, right? They like to say, oh, there's rules with this money, like we can do this, we can't do that. You know, they just want to kind of sometimes have a wall between them. And sometimes they don't, but they still have trouble helping people understand it. And so that I think was the kind of core of what CivicLex was trying to do, was to make it so that people who have been advocating in their community for years, who have been showing up and expressing their needs and expressing what needs to happen, have the tools to do so in a way that really speaks the language of the decision makers who are deciding where this money can go. And so that project, it was really satisfying and fulfilling. It was also at times really frustrating. But I think in general that it was great. And I think that the city of Lexington, maybe partly because CivicLex has been bugging them about public input for the last 5 years, had a really solid public input process for this. They had a survey out that I think 7,000 residents answered. They took project submissions where residents could submit proposals to the community. They got 1,800 project submissions. CivicLex probably helped 30 people draft their own proposals, making sure that their ideas could actually be funded by this ARPA money. And a lot of those projects got funded. So yeah, it was about strengthening the people who already show up and already know what is important and just making sure that you have the tools to get there.
Thank you, Kit. Every community should have a CivicLex. we all need that kind of transparency with budgets. That is one thing I think we can all say that we have learned during this process. Sanford, want to give you a few minutes to talk about your work.
Sure. I'm trying to think like Civic Clark. Like, I don't know if it has the same ring to it, but we'll workshop that a little bit. Hello. My name is Sanford Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Teach Plus Mississippi. Our mission is to get excellent, experienced, and diverse teachers opportunities to take leadership over policy and practice issues that advance student equity, student success, and better outcomes. So I get to work with an excellent group of teachers from all over the state of Mississippi, and I get them involved in helping to advance policy. What I have learned in this role, and I've been in this role for about 3 years, is that people trust great teachers at the state level, at the local level, even at the national level. So what we've tried to do is make sure that teacher voice is included in the policy decisions that are going to affect students and going to affect schools. When we in 2020, one of the first things we did was a survey of about 2,400 teachers throughout the state of Mississippi to find out how is it going when it comes down to teaching during the pandemic. Teachers told us a lot of things that they needed. They were very concerned about the digital divide. They were very concerned about, you know, catching students up academically. And at the time, we thought it was just going to be like a 3-month disruption. Like we had no idea it was going to be a 2-year disruption. But one of the things that really stood out was addressing the social and emotional and mental health needs of students. They knew that students were going to be isolated. They knew that students were in homes that may not be safe. They were away from the resources that they needed. They were away from their classmates. They were away from teachers that they had built trust with. And they were very concerned about what resources need to be in place when they come back. So we knew that mental health was something that we were going to need to prioritize. Through this project, we were able to conduct focus groups because there was a lot of stimulus funding that arrived in Mississippi after the survey. So we wanted to know what teachers would prioritize. Once again, mental health was one of the things that was prioritized. So we tried to address this in a couple of different ways based on what teachers were telling us. First, we wanted to make sure that teachers had access to training. So we provided mental health first aid training for our fellows and other teachers within our teacher network. We also started advocating for legislation that would address the mental health needs of students and teachers. The legislation that we were advocating for would have required training for teachers. It would have required screening for students to identify students who were dealing with mental health challenges. It would also require the Department of Education to provide mental health resources at the district and at the school level. Unfortunately, that legislation did not make it all the way to the governor's desk, but the work has continued. The Department of Education has been working on getting those resources. They are putting together a trauma-informed toolkit, and a couple of our alums have been a part of that process. What we've been focused on recently is around systems and what systems need to be in place at the school level and at the district level to make sure that resources are actually being utilized. It's great to have a toolkit, but if schools are not prepared to actually turn that into an actionable resource, then it's just going to be something that sits on a shelf. So we have really been thinking about what role do teachers play, what role do counselors play, what role do social workers, administrators, and students play to make sure that students get the mental health services that they need. So over the next couple of months, we are going to be reaching out to teachers, counselors, students, everyone to find out what would they prioritize in terms of building this system. And what we want to focus on is co-creating that system to make sure that mental health needs are addressed.
Thank you for that, Sanford. You know, I'm just reminded again, as I'm reminded about all of your pieces of work, that we could spend 3 hours having a conversation because there's so much to dig into here. But I want to start with the whole issue around budgets, and also just remind everyone who's on live, if you have a question you'd like to have posed to the group, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A function, and I'll pay attention to that. I think one thing that I heard from everyone throughout this process, throughout this Action Accelerator, was it was just a reminder again, not just because of the ARPA funding or the federal relief funding where there were so many more dollars, but just about the importance of budgets, right? And how important it is for advocates to be aware and engaged in the budgeting process. Because I think I had said at some point, you know, that budgets always reflect policy priorities, but I think it was actually Zakiyah that you said, like, well, budgets are actually reflect our moral priorities, right? Or our values, right? And so as advocates, we sort of ignore those at our peril. So I'm wondering for all of you, but maybe especially to start with Kit and Zakiyah, like, what would your advice be to other advocates about how to engage in budgets and budgeting, not just while these dollars are around, but at any time? Like, what are the real lessons learned? You mentioned your relationship with the comptroller, Zakiyah, and I know finding people that will be transparent and help you help advocates understand the process is really important. But we'd just love to hear what your advice would be to others.
Yeah, you know, we do a training every time we go. So we're a statewide advocacy group. So New York City is one portion of the statewide work that we do. And we always try to educate folks on the process of the budget as a whole. Like, who are your city council members? Who should you be? Who's your state elected officials? Like, that's something that's 101 and like these conversations around anything that has to do with budget. So people have a better understanding of who they are and who they can go to. I think also to your point of like having relationships with folks who can help monitor the money when we don't have capacity. Often parents and community members or even CBOs, you know, depending on how much funding you might not have the capacity to unpack a budget. Like, what exactly is in it? What's the fine print on it? Because that's where we often get screwed, is in the fine print. It's like, oh yeah, this looks really good on the surface. And then you like just go below, and that the one that you need a magnifying glass to look at is where you get screwed over on. And that's usually most of the budget, most of the time. And so I think in the past, while we don't have the best relationship with our teachers union right now, but in the past, they are often a great resource because they have access to all the things. Even your principals union, unions folks, period, have a better sense of that because they have someone who's probably looking into that. So building relationships with unions in your community, seeing if they can help you. We have an independent budget office. They also are very helpful. So if you have anyone, I think, what do they call them? Good cause democracy groups often are paying attention to budgets too. And they are already doing the work. So you can just ask them for that too and explaining it. At the end of the day, it's really important for parents to really to fine tune it as much as you can and answer any questions. So parents have a sense of where they could go, but also they understand, and young people and anyone else, they understand that there is no dumb question, because I know how hard it can be. You get into spaces, you're like, a budget? I don't know what you're talking about. I know my budget. I'm trying to pay for this, this, and the other. But we're talking about billions of dollars, millions of, hundreds of thousands of kids, like all those things. I don't understand what this is. And so the only way to alleviate that is to like really break it down in bite-sized pieces, but also make it relative and realistic. So when we talk about budgets and we say, that every year you have to buy hand sanitizer, copy paper, pencils, or all the things. That's if you have one child. Now you multiply that if you have multiple children. You wonder why you're always paying those things. You may not mind it, but it doesn't mean that you have the money to do it either. And sometimes it's just that basic, simple understanding of, oh yeah, I'm pulling out this. Why do I have to? Why can't schools afford that? And then you kind of fine tune it to be like, well, this is how schools get funded. These are your elected officials. It often shifts to also people wanting to understand about the electoral process of things too, right? Which is important because as we have been seeing for a while, and if we didn't know already, elections matter on all levels, from school boards to, your city council members, aldermen, et cetera.
So Kit, just to pick up on that, as an organization that's committed to, participatory budgeting even, right? Like, tell us more about how you, what your advice would be to others about how to find out what's happening in budget, affect budgets. And then you also have made the point, as I think all of you have said, about implementation. So following the money, making sure you don't, let that go. If you could say more about what your advice to others would be.
Yeah, definitely. I think Zakiyah just gave the best possible advice for someone looking to bring other people into the budget process, which is like bring it down to something on their level. Like that's the takeaway from there for sure. Build relationships and make it make sense to them. If you want advice for how to make a budget make sense to you, like if you're starting, I would say one, don't be intimidated. Like they're long and they're confusing looking, but they, every budget follows a structure throughout it, right? So once you understand one page, you basically understand all 700 pages. So don't get overwhelmed would be one piece of advice. And the other one is, I think, Sandy, a little bit to what you were saying is try to understand the entirety of like the life cycle of a budget, right? Like to the extent that people know about, say, our city's budget in Lexington, which, isn't super high, but to the extent that they do know it is like in April of every year, the mayor gives a budget address, talks about her funding priorities, and then there's a council meeting and then the budget passes. But that is like, the cake is like 95% baked by the time that budget address happens. There's a couple small changes, but like it is mainly over. And every year some people show up then to advocate for something. And in most cases, it's kind of too late. So like, although a budget document is, something that's numbers and math, there's still a narrative right behind it. And so if you can try to understand like the fullness of like, where does it start? Like, who is originally drafting this? Like, I can tell you about it in the city of Lexington. I don't know if it's the same in other cities, but there's a whole kind of life cycle behind it. And I think to the extent that you can try to understand that and build relationships on those steps of the process is definitely to your advantage. And then on the other side of that life cycle, after the budget passes, is the implementation, which we all know is huge. And it's like not good news on implementation. Like it basically means you just have to keep paying attention forever, which is kind of a lot. But it is about like continuing to show up and having a network of people who can keep going to meetings and keep trying to understand what's happening and keep that pressure up through implementation. And gosh, there was one other thing I was going to say, and I just immediately forgot it. But yeah,
I'm going to come back to
the basics.
I'm going to come back to implementation in a minute. So if you remember what it is, you can hop back in.
Right.
I'm going to go to Sanford and Shirley, because I think you both of the projects that you worked on really reflected priorities that we've heard across the country, right? That mental and behavioral health, well-being, what is just a huge need, probably was there before the pandemic, certainly exacerbated by the pandemic, but you both in your own ways managed to bust silos, right? Shirley, with what you just said about being able to not just to think about helping the community's mental health, not just what that being the responsibility of schools, but communities. And then Sanford, your work with teachers also being not just in a particular district, but across your state, and really thinking about these issues statewide. So I was hoping you could say just a little bit more about that work and how people can think about solving big problems, outside of maybe the silos that we are sort of consistently placed in. So Shirley, I thought I'd start with you.
So as I'm listening to the conversation, Sandy, two things jumped out. One sort of relates to, the question of, what are budgets? And I would say, at least in a county, Montgomery County is a large county, over 1 million residents. When the county council, that is our funder, does their budget hearings, it reinforces the silos. The school system comes in and talks about its needs, the Health and Human Services come in and talk about theirs, the police come in. And so what we were working on in our effort was to bring people together from those different places around a shared need, a sense of urgency around something that was being experienced. And so one way to advocate is to sort of think about getting the funding bodies to go at their own processes of learning in different ways, not institution by institution, but perhaps by a need that is cross-cutting. And so that was one of the things that we did. And then, I think the other way that we came to sort of where you're going on implementation was this idea also of having some accountability oversight at the system level, right? At the people who are impacted. So to have the Black and Brown Coalition, or to have low to the ground community-based nonprofits participate in saying, okay, so these dollars have been allocated to hire X number more social workers, or X number more positive youth development trainers that invested in wellness centers. How is it going? How many students and families have we served? What is the feedback that we're getting? Are we asking them how it's working? So almost creating those teams, as Kit was saying, front end, back end, teams at the front end, at the back end. At the front end to talk about cross-cutting needs with the authenticity of it coming from them sharing their own stories, but then staying together in cross-cutting ways to say, is it now working? And are you asking the right people? Is this now serving your need? Have you been able to access it? Is it what you expected? What more can we do?
Do you think that in the talking beyond just, not just talking to the schools, but talking in the county and all the other experts, that not only did that not only sort of solve the issue about there not being enough funding to get done what needed to be done, right? That there was more funding available, but did you also feel like that provided a better opportunity like improve understanding about what the needs of those communities might be, since we know that sometimes, you know, when you operate in silos, people don't necessarily actually understand the needs of, for example, the Black and Brown community, that's part of the resource allocation issue.
100%. I mean, I think the way you design who gets invited into the conversation, right? That's the point that everyone was making, right? Zakiyah was starting us out there. Who gets invited to be in the conversation is really going to shape where focus and attention is, right? And to the point that Sanford was making about equity, right? To be equitable, you need to deliberately and intentionally make sure that you have included in meaningful ways, not as a checkbox, but in meaningful ways, traditionally underserved communities, so that you are having them share with you where have been the barriers, where are they seeing the need, what would it take for them to feel like a resource was accessible, but also had the right impact. So I definitely think it changes the lens. It makes it clear that it helps drive the conversation for resources to go to need and not just be sort of distributed equally across all schools or all parts of the community. It really speaks to understanding need at a deeper level.
Yeah, especially for communities that have been historically under-resourced by those previous budgets. Yeah. Sanford, why don't you go ahead and pick up on that?
So what's interesting around the mental health discussion in Mississippi is that there are three different conversations, at least three different conversations that are taking place. Teachers are having a conversation, our school counselors are having a conversation, our outside service providers, like our therapists, our social workers, they're having a separate conversation. And what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we get everybody at the table to figure out, okay, all of you are saying the exact same thing. All of you are talking about the same priorities. All of you are talking about the same needs. So how can we all come together? And then also, how do we bring students into the conversation too, so they can say, this is what I really need. Like, this is what I want from teachers. This is what I want from counselors. So I think that's what's really got us to really focus on not just what resources are provided, but what systems are in place. We've heard from counselors that, one, there aren't enough, and that is exactly true. And then what we've also heard from counselors is that the ones that are there are having to focus more on academic counseling as opposed to mental health counseling. So there's not enough folks who, like, I can't spend time with students because I have to handle report cards, or I have to handle testing, or I've got to figure out who made the honor roll this year. And there need to be some conversations at the school level about how are we staffing schools to make sure that counselors have the time to meet with students, that teachers have the ability and have the skills to identify students who need mental health services. And at the school level, are these things, do we have the resources within our schools, within our districts, or do we need to partner with community or state organizations to make sure that students get the services that they need? So those are the things that we really want to focus on right now, is figuring out what are the priorities, like what does everyone need? Do we have those resources within our communities, or are there gaps that we need to fill, either with local or state or even federal resources?
Thank you for that. I want to reinforce one point that I think sometimes in these conversations, especially when we talk a lot about mental health, doesn't often get reinforced. And that is that I think I've heard all of you say, and Zakiyah sort of set it up at the beginning, right, that the pandemic, right, and talking with communities uncovered this real need for support around kids and families' well-being, but that is not, you know, that also is not in a silo. It is closely connected with when and whether kids are going to be able to learn and to attain, you know, the academic success that we hope they will have. And I know that all of you in your work, you talk about those things as being, you know, hand in glove, not an either or. And I just want to kind of reinforce that idea that this isn't mental health at the expense of academics, or it's actually both. We got to do both, or we're not going to be able to. Go ahead, Zakiyah.
Just real quick, I just wanted to say, you know, and in this struggle, I'm going to say that implementation is the hardest thing. One, because there's always a kitchen sink being thrown at us. We get the house thrown at us, and we're like trying to move on to the next thing to try to bring some level of sanity and freedom and liberation to our spaces, right? And so we're always ready to just move on to the next thing. And it's really difficult. Another reason is because many of the parents and community members are young people that are often part of the process of getting where you are also being pulled in different directions because they're part of something else. Because once you take on one thing, there's something else that pops up. Someone wants you engaged because it seems like there's not a lot of us or parents and community members around who are able to do these things for a whole host of reasons, right? And so they often get pulled. The other thing I want to say is that in this work, when you're working with Black and Brown communities, it often is a tug on the heart and the spirit that everything you have to fight for all the things, every time you turn around is a struggle and a fight. And in those moments, I want to implore folks, as one, people are being pulled in different directions. Two, it's really a struggle out there, like nobody's business in this moment. Across the board for folks of color, Indigenous folks, like there's just everything that could be going wrong, including our children being, attacked and assaulted and all the things, right? Including, to me, an assault, state sanctioned violence is like not funding their education intentionally, right? For decades is a state sanctioned violence, et cetera. Is that there's a need for help, for healing processes, for your meetings to have a space for folks to just be, to not talk about the work or to just talk about something else that brings them joy. And be intentional about that, because there's always room to move forward around the things that are just hard to deal with and that we need to like struggle and fight for. The joy part sometimes is, more far apart than it needs to be and it should be. And if we are to move forward and do these things and have folks be sustainable in this moment, in this space long before, because this is not a sprint, it is a marathon that we're on, then we have to create ways for ourselves as organizers, no matter what ethnicity, nationality you are yourself, to find joy, but definitely in those spaces where you are, you have an agenda and all those things, there have to be spaces for joy, rest, and just for folks to be.
I really appreciate you saying that. And I think that's one of the things that we believe that, or we hope, right, that the action accelerators provide for project leaders, right? Like we all need to find spaces where we can share and be in community with other people, sometimes around the work, but sometimes just to to find connection, because that's so important, right? The work is never really over. So I want to thank everybody. I am not surprised we're a little bit over time because of course we were going to be, but I want to thank you again, Kit, Sanford, Shirley, and Zakiyah, for joining us on the live part of this. Again, this will be posted to YouTube within a week. You can rewatch this. We are going to move now to the off the record discussion, and those of you that put questions in the chat box, we are going to get to them now. So please, if you would like to stay, we hope you will. We're going to transition now to the off the record session. And again, thanks to all of the amazing ARPA participants.